Right, people just take their seats again now, please, and we'll resume very shortly. Right, let's resume the hearing, please. Okay. Okay, so what we'll do now, we're still looking at distributed development. We will start with RPS and just go around the table.
Thank you, sir. Just picking up on the question, really, about the distribution of development. I think you've had prayed and aid the merits of Evesham, and I think the council's also prayed and aid for the merits actually of Malvern. The other main settlement, main town, is obviously Droitwich. So the three main towns, and those three main towns will roll forward from the previous plan, and those are the three urban areas along with the new settlements. And I think that's correct, and what was said in relation to Evesham would equally apply in relation to Droitwich. It's a main town with a mainline train station, a 30-minute train journey into New Street, along with a significant amount of services and facilities. Got two principal points or concerns. So one relates to the villages, another relates to delivery assumptions from the new settlements. And appreciate you'll be picking up issues in relation to both and in respective matters. I won't go into the detail of them. In relation to the villages, the growth of the villages, we're reminded strategic objective 14 of the plan is to allocate most development in locations with good access to services and facilities and where transport choice is maximised. I put it to you, so that won't be happening through providing 1,700 dwellings as a minimum to the villages. And that's not just my view, sir. That's the view of Wyre Forest District Council, who've put representations to yourselves concerning raising their concerns regarding the spatial distribution of there being many villages having significant amounts of residential development. That's an adjoining authority saying that to you. And put it in simple terms, sort of holding growth back at one of the three main towns, in my view, in favour of a less sustainable option or approach is inconsistent with the strategy of the plans. In relation to the new settlements, again, you've had commentary put to you, and we're not, unlike others, we're not opposing the new settlements. And you're clearly going to hear issues at matter 9 in relation to the new settlements about the scale of growth being focused there, and I'm sure concerns about viability of them, land ownerships, and the overall, I suppose, risks to the plan against the delivery trajectory of those new settlements. So I've got no need to get into that, but those substantial schemes will take a substantial period of time, yet the plan is anticipating delivery from them within the midpoint of the plan. I was heavily involved in the original South Worcester plan examination, and indeed I promoted one of the strategic extensions in Malvern. The examination started in 2014. We submitted an application in the same year, in 2014. It's taken 10 years to get an outline planning permission. Now, that's no fault of ourselves or the council. Everyone worked very hard to get that through. But it shows the length of time. And if you look at the other principal strategic extension, South Worcester, it actually took slightly longer, is my understanding, to get to an outline consent. So there's just a big air of caution about the length of time and the evidence you may hear at this examination and the views about delivery. So those are outline schemes. You've still got to go through all of the reserve matters, infrastructure delivery, before you start seeing actual completions. So the question then is what is the plan B, or what is the contingency relating to the distribution of growth? And the council thinks put it to you there's a 20% over provision. That is a 20% over provision in relation to the allocations, but it's an 8.5% over provision against the plan as a whole. And you'll be aware, so the plan as a whole is looking at existing commitments, he's looking at windfall rates and everything else. So it's an 8.5% over provision. You'll get into that, I'm sure. So I suppose that's our concern really, is you've got a distribution strategy that we say inappropriately focuses growth on the less sustainable options, and has significant concerns about delivery from the new settlements. And that's at the expense, so we say to you, from the main towns, those existing 3 main towns, and in particular, Droitwich. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we will be coming on to looking at the deliverability of the allocated sites in due course, and it's part of us putting together our entire picture. And as we said before, when we get to the end, we'll know what we're looking at. Okay, thank you. I will not ask the council to come back into this point. If you briefly.
No, thank you. So yeah, I'll just cover the key points. So again, as the case with Evesham, we have significant plans for Droitwich within the urban area, a number of allocations on brownfield land coming forward, and again we've prepared an investment prospectus for Droitwich to support its regeneration within the centre. So a number of key sites and allocations within the plan itself. In terms of the dispersal of development, as I've said, category 1, 2 and 3 villages, 1,700 homes. I mean, that is 8.5% of the allocations. So, it's a limited amount. Obviously, there's others saying you could have done more than that. We feel it's the right balance between supporting rural viability, bringing some new development forward within the sustainable categories, whilst recognising that our overall strategy is to focus development into the strategic sites and elsewhere. So we feel we have a very robust approach to delivery. The phasing of strategic sites, certainly looking at the urban extensions, yes, they did take a long time to come forward. They've had nothing like the level of front loading which we've been doing on the strategic sites in this plan. And we will hear on Worcestershire Parkway the extent of work that's been done on viability, infrastructure, the resourcing within the council to deal with this project, so it moves forward very, very quickly. And importantly, we have a statement of common ground with the landowners on Worcestershire Parkway confirming that our delivery trajectory of 500 homes is achievable within that period. So we're very confident our trajectory is robust. And as was pointed out, we do have a 27% over provision on the allocations, so there is flexibility within.
Okay. What we will be looking to achieve would be an updated trajectory by after the hearings, really to see where we've got to once we've considered what we need to consider, and that will inform us really other questions we have about the requirement, etc., which we'll sort of cut on tomorrow. Okay, so move on around the table. PRE, I think.
We are on question 15, aren't we? I've a bit lost track of where we are.
We are talking about the distribution, so it's sort of 13. We'll come on to 15 was a point, well, related sort of to 15, but we'll come back to that one. Okay. Okay, moving along. RCA, is it?
Thank you, sir. Yes, it was just I know we're not supposed to reiterate points, but I'm going to anyway, which is this rail-based strategy. And you've got Evesham that has a railway station, but because it's got congestion, it can't grow to the degree that it needs to, and that is proportionate to the affordable housing need and the number of existing dwellings in the settlement, which seems like this sort of very negative circular argument, instead of finding ways to sustainably grow a town that really needs to grow to underpin its vitality and viability economically. So, and I suppose something similar happens with Droitwich. As a resident of Droitwich, I think Droitwich needs to grow. I am very well versed with Droitwich's brownfield sites, having been involved in development appraisals, looking at what they can and can't afford in terms of 106 contributions. And Droitwich brownfield sites do suffer from serious viability issues, I'm afraid. And I think that this is being glossed over by the council. The prioritisation of brownfield land nationally is something that is very laudable. But one thing that a lot of these sites are now facing are biodiversity net gain, which is a matter for consideration here because it's a change in legislation as opposed to a change in the NPPF per se. Now, that is a cost to development, and it is a significant cost to brownfield development if you are unfortunate enough to be in a situation where you've got open mosaic baselines in ecology terms. And we've seen brownfield sites fail to come forward on that basis because they can't afford the off-site credits. So yes, brownfield as a priority is important, and I note what was said about Evesham Town Centre and the lovely regeneration proposed for there and also for Droitwich. But I am seriously concerned that there is no serious plan to grow these towns sustainably where this development can come forward quickly on an unconstrained basis. Brownfield sites are heavily constrained in those areas and they're not very high value in the town centres either. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McLeod, any come back on the brownfield site issue?
Yes, certainly, but there's obviously opportunities to work with partners to deliver those brownfield sites. And in the case of Evesham, one of the key regeneration priorities in the investments prospectus is the Riverside Shopping Centre, which is the dilapidated shopping centre. We're working very closely with Homes England to bring that site forward. So it's easy to dismiss sites on grounds of viability, but working with partners, we're making significant progress on bringing that site forward for development, and we're very confident of delivery within this plan. So, and it's important, particularly in Evesham and Droitwich, to focus development within the centres. Evesham Town Centre needs regeneration. That's the priority for our investments prospectus. I would be more than happy to submit those documents for you to see the priority the councils is placing on those market towns. And it certainly isn't the case that we're ignoring them. There's significant potential within the town centres to support new growth for new housing and commercial opportunities as well. And that will add to the vibrancy. And as I said previously, those settlements they've got a number of houses proposed in this plan, and they've also had growth in previous plans in the case of Evesham. So we're very happy with the approach we're taking there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving around the table.
Thank you, Sir. Nathan McLaughlin for Castlethorpe and Terra Strategic. Just obviously, in the interest of openness, Terra and Castlethorpe have a number of applications in Cat 1 settlements, which are at an advanced stage. And in terms of points I want to make in response to this question, I want to flip the question slightly on its head in terms of what's the role and function of the housing distribution strategy with rural areas in mind in SWDP R03? What's its function from a development control standpoint? But just looking at it, and I don't want to bounce around some of the other issues we've discussed this morning, and obviously what we've got coming up tomorrow with the housing land supply day. But my reading of the policy is that it disaggregates the housing figure across several locations in urban areas and rural areas. But there's no actual explanations to what this distribution strategy is supposed to achieve. Why is there, for example, in Malvern, a total of 217 dwellings as new allocations in Cat 1 settlements? I would just like to make a point. Is this designed as a tool to prevent the over-delivery of housing in rural areas? Or is it something just trying to act as a bar to sort of explain that the plan is trying to just distribute a notional level of housing out to these settlements? My worry is that it could be used from an interpretation point of view, that if a Cat 1 settlement was over-delivering, then there is the vagarity in the policy that would allow it to effectively be used as a moratorium to prevent additional development in Cat 1 settlements. Now, notwithstanding the government's newfound fondness for house building and the fact we are reliant on the December 23 framework, if I remember rightly, the then government was still committed to building homes for people. So I think I'm probably looking for better clarity and understanding about what the role of the disaggregation policy is within SWDPR 03. And I just think yeah, sorry, if I can just draw it there. I've lost my train of thought at that point, sir.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. So the purpose of the table is to demonstrate how we're delivering the plan in line with the sustainability appraisal and in the way which delivers the most sustainable form of development. And that's what we've assessed, and the table demonstrates the most sustainable way of doing that through the settlement hierarchy which we have put forward. And just to be clear, there is no moratorium on development. These reflect the allocations which we've seen come forward. There was nothing to stop further sites coming forward, whether it be in Malvern, Evesham or Droitwich. All of these areas, these give a clear direction in terms of what we've allocated, but there's been no moratorium to stop other sites coming forward, and the plan would enable that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of confirm to you earlier that the numbers set out in the table in policy 3 are just reflective of what the plan is allocating. Isn't it? This is what the plan's doing, but it's not to say this is the totality.
No, absolutely right.
Yeah. And it doesn't account for commitments.
No, absolutely, and we're starting work on that table to demonstrate that point.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Your train of thought back.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And actually, I think what's just been discussed partly picks up my train of thought, because the other point I was going to make is, given that is just a table that's just indicating how distribution has taken place and not a distribution strategy. If it was a distribution strategy, it wouldn't be working because of housing land supply issues and effectively everything coming forward into category 1, category 2 rural settlements. And I appreciate that's a piece of work that the council sort of basically assigned themselves to do in terms of providing that update, how much additional housing is being delivered in other settlements.
Yeah, I mean, what we're looking for is a picture of what the plan's going to provide overall. What we're not suggesting is that numbers appear in the plan, because the work hasn't been done to justify that. That's not the basis of which the plan's been prepared. And whether that could ever be effective, who knows? I mean, it's a big ask, isn't it, to start doing that? How do you apportion it, etc. So we're certainly not suggesting that. In some ways, what this table is doing, it's helpful, but also potentially misleading at the same time. But I think some clarity about what these numbers are would be really useful. Just make sure that, make it clear that these do not set, in terms of the allocations, it's not setting sub-area requirements or anything nuanced like that, because it's not. I can imagine people, if it's not clear, spending a lot of time at section 78 inquiries discussing whether it does. Well, it doesn't, does it? So we just need to make clear that it doesn't. Okay, moving along.
Thank you, sir. Sarah Bushfield from Pegasus Group. Not wishing to repeat earlier points about wind pools, but I think taking that point and perhaps moving it on a bit is, we've heard from the council there are, a significant proportion of the plan's proposed dwellings directed towards new settlements, and then the urban areas, and there is then 1,691 dwellings proposed for the category 1 to 3 settlements. Given that there are a very large number of villages and settlements in South Worcestershire, it seems actually a very low proportion, and certainly less than 10% of the overall requirement for the plan. And there are settlements within those category 1 to 3 villages that could accommodate more, such as Hartlebury, for example, which is a category 1 settlement. It has a railway station, but has a very small proportion of proposed growth and development, yet it's supposed to be, a sustainable settlement. And a point that I was just thinking about, haven't done the maths, but the NPPF requires at least 10% of the housing requirement to be on sites no larger than 1 hectare. And I was just wondering, as I said, I haven't done the maths, but if that has actually been achieved with what is being proposed here.
We have
Probably
evidence
good.
about that, don't we?
Well, Hosbury is surrounded by green belts, so that's why there's no further proposals coming forward there. So it goes back to the points we made earlier.
Yeah, and the points about the 10% coming forward on small sites, that's in the evidence, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we will have a better idea of what the totality is being effectively apportioned to smaller settlements once all the commitments are taken into account. Because the answer will be a higher number than we've got before us at the moment. We just don't have that clarity at the moment. But we'll be getting that at some point, which will be helpful. Okay, just move, if you've finished, if you put your board down, please, we just move on around the table. There's another board that's got up on this side. I don't know whether that's a legacy board. No? Okay, we'll go around and come back to you and then we'll wind up on this one.
Thank you, sir. Conor Flanagan from Black Box Planning. We're pretty clear that the, in response to question 13, the distribution's not effective. And the reason for that is the over-reliance on a small number of strategic sites. I think Mr. Hill gave you a local example of the reality of timescales associated with these type of sites. So we think the trajectory is overly optimistic. In addition to that, it assumes good local market conditions. When you look at the trajectory from 28, 29, all the way up to 40, 41, it's pretty, solid that the local market is going to be able to perform, and that's a fair assumption to be making. So it's overly optimistic. There's numerous examples of plans falling away, including in neighbouring Gloucestershire, where we have a plan where there's no reliance on a small number of large strategic sites. The Joint Core Strategy was adopted in December 2017, and we're only just seeing the first plots come off one of the strategic sites in that plan. That's 8 years later. So the plan requires a greater proportion of growth in the better villages with close proximity to Worcester, as per my earlier point. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, we'll come back to the specifics about these sites tomorrow.
Yes, thank you, sir. Rhys Sadler from Marins on behalf of Lone Star Land Limited. I just wanted to echo concerns raised by colleagues around the table on the issue of over-reliance on the new settlements and the questions over trajectory, which I know we'll come to on matter 9, and the impact that has, therefore, on the village sites in particular, and the rest of the hierarchy as well. Specifically, want to pick up on Broadway, recognising that Broadway is the largest and most sustainable village in South Worcestershire, as is evidenced by the council's own evidence base, and the lack of additional allocations that are being made in Broadway. So there's one reallocation and one new site for 30 dwellings, but that is all for Broadway, and we say so that is insufficient to meet the needs for Broadway itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Move on around the table, and then we'll let the council come back. Yep, so carry on, please.
Yeah, I wanted to offer my support for the comments that the numbers in the hierarchy are overly reliant on the strategic sites. I think we've heard today that the assumptions around numbers there are based on the council's assessment of how many sites, plots I think they're likely to be delivered across the plan period. I'm very conscious that's going to fall in tomorrow's matter 4, so I won't go into that now. But I think the point there is, you'll have your own judgment and your own assessment on that, and whether there'll be counter views on that, and you'll reach your own conclusions about what the final number should be, about what's a realistic sort of target or number for those across the plan period. I'd also like to offer my support as well for the comments around the towns within the South Worcestershire area, so specifically Droitwich, Evesham and Malvern. This goes back to the point I was making earlier about the hierarchy, and I think that it's distorted at the moment. I think when you strip out the Worcester urban extensions as actually being part of Worcester, and we strip away the much smaller settlements of Worcestershire Parkway and Throckmorton Airfield, as they will be at the end of the plan period, we're left with three towns, all of which have railway stations, all of which are deemed to be the most sustainable locations, bar Worcester, within the council, within the area, to deliver housing, but a very, very small number of houses being distributed to them. I won't go into all the reasons why that's, the reasons why more houses should be located there. I think we've heard lots of them around the table. But ultimately, we have, there's meeting the housing need, the viability of the settlements, provision of affordable housing for local, to meet local people's needs. And I think that's masked at the moment by the way the hierarchy is presented. But I do think there's a strong point there that actually, in order for the plan to be justified, the whole purpose of this is to direct housing or development to the most sustainable locations. Everyone agrees these are the most sustainable locations, but we're not really directing development to them. And there's lots of benefits as to why more development should go in those locations. The other thing I would say, and I know you've pointed out a few times, sir, this is about soundness and whether the plan and the strategy is sound. And if you do, when you do go through that process and you consider the wider sort of considerations about how many houses might be delivered in other locations, if you do get to that point where there is a question mark around whether or not enough allocations do exist to actually meet the housing requirement. And I think there is a double benefit from putting more housing into the market, into the towns. Not only does it help the towns individually, but it has the potential to help the plan as a whole in being effective in meeting the requirement that's been set out within it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ian Bowden, Crowell Parish Council. I just wanted to pick up on the moratorium point and just sort of following on from that, make the point that in our rural villages, our rural communities that need to grow, but that growth needs to be sustainable. And where housing delivery has been brought forward, it needs to be recognised that it takes time for the social cohesion of that to take place into the existing village. It doesn't happen overnight, that takes time. And villages are characterised, the rural character of villages is important. If we build too much too quickly, that can be forever lost. If we take the case of Crowell just as a case example, irrespective of the allocation in the SWDPR, which we have no issue with actually, the existing planning applications that have been approved far out exceed that already, and we'll see something like a 49% increase in the size of the village. And that must be recognised, and it must be recognised that it will then take time for that social cohesion to take place. And therefore this moratorium point, I think, is a very valid and important one and should be brought into planning policy.
Thank you. Again, the council are preparing the overall picture in terms of provision beyond the allocation. So we'll get a better indication of how existing commitments feed into all of that. I've got your point about moratorium. We've got the opposite point about moratorium, and we'll take those away. Okay, so I really want to start moving on. So we'll go to RCA, and I think it's CPRE, and then we'll go back to the council for final comments, and we'll shift on. I suspect we're close to exhausting this one.
Thank you. It was partly just because I'd raised some points directly before the break that the council didn't come back directly on. But having heard what everyone else around the table has said, I wanted to pick up on the not a moratorium point as well, because it effectively is. If there's no weighting being given for distribution on this rail-based strategy so that the more sustainable villages in each category take more numbers, and if there's no numbers being allocated to certain neighbourhood plan areas because they're being deemed to have already met their requirement, and there's no numbers being illustratively allocated to any of the other settlements, and there are no settlement boundary extensions for future growth, there is going to be no new development. Where is it going to go? If you find this plan sound and that it will have a 5-year housing land supply on adoption, those would potentially be the only sites that could come forward, because all of those points that I've just outlined effectively mean that there kind of isn't anywhere else or any other way of delivering housing, and these unachievable neighbourhood plan area numbers in particular that need redistributing, because they're not going to happen either. So I am concerned that it is a moratorium. I am still concerned about the points I raised earlier. You did suggest that some of them might be picked up tomorrow, and I just wondered when, because I couldn't see anything in particular around sort of neighbourhood plan numbers, etc., on tomorrow's programme. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to briefly touch that tomorrow, well, now, and then tomorrow we'll go through the different components of supply. One potential component of supply is the housing provision to neighbourhood areas. I need to explore that and to actually get to the bottom of how that relates to the overall supply. I'm unclear at the moment as to whether the figures in Annex E, is it, whether in totality that is included within supply, or whether that's an additional source of supply for the plan period as a whole. It's not clear to me. So that's one of my questions I was going to put in tomorrow as part of the overall supply. Tomorrow we will develop from the questions we've posed, move on and look at the different components, which includes that. It's still an unanswered question. I'm not looking for an answer to that question at the moment. We'll come back to that. But yeah, well, we'll cover it somewhere. I'll work out how I'm going to do it later this evening. Yeah.
Sorry, I've just realised I didn't have my microphone on. Yeah, we'd asked to sit at Matter 4 and weren't granted that, so we're only here for Matter 5 tomorrow. So that's why I want to clarify that we're not going to miss the opportunity to discuss this if you were going to do it under 4 rather than 5 tomorrow.
Let's remind me what this. It's about supply, so it's Matter 5. Matter 4 is about requirement, so that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, CPRE.
I wanted to follow up on the moratorium point. Some of the villages have had their allocation for the existing plan built out in the first few years of that plan, leaving nothing to be provided to meet needs arising in the later years of the plan, which is why we've been getting planning by appeal rather than by plan. My point is therefore that there ought to be some kind of phasing on the delivery of sites in villages which do tend to be attractive to people wanting to use unsustainable means of transport to get to work. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McLeod, do you want to pick up any of those points before we move on?
Well, of course, so I think the first key one is that there is no moratorium. I'm not sure where a moratorium has come from, to be honest. But there is no moratorium on development. We've set out an approach within that table which allocates significant land to many of the areas which are being said, well, that there isn't enough development. You know, Troy, which has nearly 1,000 homes, Evesham over 600. I think Pershaw was quoted, which has nearly 500, and obviously has Throckmorton very close to its railway station, which will benefit significantly from access to it. So that is simply not the case. Neighbourhood plans, so the point of neighbourhood plans is that they can define their own needs and allocate land appropriately if it's in accordance with the spatial strategy. And there is absolutely nothing in this plan stopping them to do that. So we've actively encouraged neighbourhood planning across the three councils, and we will continue to encourage them to do that and to identify appropriate land for development where they see fit, and that is entirely within the confines of the neighbourhood planning process, and there's no constraint or anything put in place which would stop that from happening. Oh, and just your point, so the figures I'm quoting obviously don't take account of commitments as well. So, you know, these are the allocations from that table, but obviously we'll give you that detail so you can see the commitments added and windfalls.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, let's move on. So we've already discussed the rail-based strategy. It's come up in a number of questions previously. I think we have all the information we need on that. So I'm happy to move on from that point. rather than revisit that. Moving on to what is our question 15, that is about criterion G of a policy, which concerns neighbourhood plans. And again, we'll dip into this tomorrow. But it's council being suggested a main modification in respect of this criterion, which is more of a statement of intent than policy. And what I want to get to the bottom of is actually what those numbers in Annex E mean. Are they actually part of the supply, and is it in addition to what's set out in the table? Because that would put a different slant on the overall provision in the plan, to my simple way of calculating. But if you can come tomorrow with that answers to that, that would be helpful. There's a CPRE has a board up. Is that a legacy board? No? Okay. Crack on then.
I'm concerned about the relationship between the strategic plan and SWDPR and neighbourhood plans, and the status of the SWDP allocations if a neighbourhood plan decides that a different site should be allocated from the one in SWDP. That a village should have, say, 50 houses is clearly a strategic policy. The site on which they should be placed is, in my submission, not a strategic policy, and is therefore one to be determined through a neighbourhood plan if one is being prepared. My worry is that SWDP says that a certain village has 50 houses in one place. The neighbourhood plan decides it actually wants slightly more than that, and it wants 60 houses, but on a different site. And I bear in mind the propensity for planning committees to ignore what neighbourhood plans say. It's unfortunate, it shouldn't happen, but it unfortunately does. Does this mean that that village is liable to get housing on both sites? In other words, 110 houses, which is contrary to the strategic policy that it should have 50, or the neighbourhood plan policy that it should have 60. This needs in my view, this needs a modification to the plan to ensure that this can't happen.
Right. Well, we are seeking to get to the bottom of this. The neighbourhood plans have to be in conformity with strategic plan. The strategic plan is setting out what the strategic plan is setting out. We'll get to the bottom of neighbourhood plans. Neighbourhood plans can make allocations. They would be non-strategic policies. And elsewhere, neighbourhood plans exist making allocations alongside allocations in strategic or this level plan. So we will get to the bottom of that tomorrow as to what exactly that means. Yes, we do. It does need clarity, which will require a main modification of sorts. Mr. McLeod?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Got the suggested main modification that you put forward on that. We'll not dwell on that at the moment because we'll see where we end up with 2 tomorrow, I think, and we'll come back to that. Right, let's move on. Criterion H. What's this about then? And I think the council have agreed with us that actually it's a statement of intent and should be deleted because you'll be doing that anyway because you have to. Okay, excellent. Right. Pleased to know we are approaching the end of this matter. Well, maybe not pleased to know, maybe you're enjoying it. Move on to significant gaps. Okay. So on the first reading of the plan, first thing that struck me was we have greenbelt and something called significant gaps in the same sentence. We have a policy, I'll call it policy 04, concerned with greenbelts. We don't have a policy concerned with significant gaps, other than what's in this policy. I mean, could someone close the door then? Will that help? Yeah. Yeah, I think every time someone moves, you can hear the footfall in the sprung floor. Is that better? Okay. Yeah, just let us know if it gets difficult, and we'll send Ian to sort them out. Okay, so significant gaps. I had a few questions about that. We've had some written responses. So we've got really 3 points moving on from the helpful response we've received. So what is the justification for significant gaps? And I've seen the evidence study. What is the intended purpose as a local designation? Hence our initial concerns about conflation with the greenbelt, because clearly they're not something that is the same as greenbelt. And what can be done to make the plan sound in this regard? Because clearly it's not quite there at the moment. Because I think although the significant gaps are expressed in current policy, this sort of moves on a bit from that, but maybe it's not moved on in the best direction. So start with the council and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, Steve. And so, in our view, significant gaps are an important part of the plan. You're absolutely correct. They don't carry the same weight as greenbelts, and we fully acknowledge that. But nevertheless, they can play an important part of decision making from a development management point of view. And the reason why significant gaps are put forward is we've seen a number of urban extensions, particularly from Worcester, which has inevitably brought the city closer to some of the surrounding villages. And Kempsey being obviously a very good example of that. What the policy approach in that particular instance does is seek to separate the urban extension boundary, but keeping a area of significant gap from what is an important conservation area with a number of listed buildings. So from a DM point of view, having a policy there which recognises that separation is important. It is not the same as you've said on Greenbelt, but it still is nevertheless something which is important in keeping that separation between what is the towns and villages around the main settlements, and we feel can play a role from a DM point of view. So that is why we've included that policy. We feel it is important that that is retained.
Okay, thank you. So this,
If I could just make one other point, they were assessed obviously as part of the last plan and retained as part of that. And part of the, when I was talking about the justification for that last time was the urban extensions coming forward. So they were seen as part of the mitigation for those urban extensions, which is still obviously being carried forward with completions to come on this plan.
so from the evidence document, I've seen that there's been a review of them, and it sets out, I think, am I right in thinking primarily that to prevent coalescence, but there are also issues around character and appearance, to use one of our favourite inspector terms of that area as well, but primarily it's a tool for coalescence. And my reading is that in the existing policy, because they exist already, it's not a high level absolute constraint, but it just shows an area where openness should be retained, but it doesn't completely rule out.
No, absolutely, and it isn't a hard criteria like the green belt, but it is certainly something we should be taking into account in the determination of planning applications if they did come forward within the significant gaps. So we feel it's important that the openness and keeping the separation between settlements like Kempsey and Worcester, it is important that that is retained, and we take account of that through determining applications if they did come forward within the significant gap.
All right. Remind me whether, okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the suggested main modification, we've had a very quick look at this. And I think that in principle, a separate policy would be necessary for soundness because it sets out what significant gaps, to set out what significant gaps are, and to identify the fact that they're tied down on the policies map, because it makes that link in policy. And also then to set out clearly any development management criteria that flow from it. I think the wording to us seems to go somewhat further in terms of preventing development than maybe you were alluding to, resulting in erosion of significant gaps. A small-scale development could do that, couldn't it? For example, so potentially, I think that would need to be looked at, I think, just to bring it back to what the overall intention is, and maybe the suggested policy might be going too far. Because you could read this, that it's actually a high-level constraint with the green belt, but there are no exceptions here. There's no very special circumstances test. Oh, right, okay. Maybe it's me flagging by the mid-afternoon. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm doing is looking at the council suggested main modification, which is very policy on significant gaps, and just exploring with the council what the scope of the policy should be. Criterion A, that is what we said it should do in terms of setting out what it is, but that it's really the criterion then that deal with what should happen there, and possibly it's a case of less is more in terms of that. Maybe just a simple statement to say that they exist to prevent coalescence and safeguard character and appearance, whatever.
We're happy to, obviously happy to look at wording to that effect. I mean, I think the way we tried to draft it is to acknowledge that there could be exceptions to this policy in the text underneath the three criteria in terms of the purpose.
Can I just be clear, sir? Which of the criteria are you concerned with? Is it Roman 2 or Roman 3?
I think B1, which is result in erosion of significant gaps. So anything that would result in erosion of it wouldn't be consented. Then 2 is actually nuanced with the word adversely.
Yeah.
You know, it's don't want to have a long discussion now about the detail,
it's too constrained,
but it's actually how it, on the face of it, in my inspector brain, it says no development in significant gaps, and that's not what you intend.
No, I mean, I think
so I think we're coming from that point of view. I don't want to sit here writing a policy, but
I mean, we are trying to allow for exceptions in the paragraph that follows from that, in that if you can demonstrate that there's no adverse effect through an evidence base, then obviously permission would be granted. But do you want us take it away in the
I
light
think
of the
so,
comments
yeah,
that you've made.
yeah.
and
We
see if
will
can come
just
back with
get
something
comments
that's
around the room as well,
bit more
but
suitable.
certainly take it away and come back to us on that one.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So I don't think as it's worded is actually what you intend. And actually, to us, it would give us concerns about consistency with national policy as it is. But we can move on from that. Okay, so we'll go on the table and we'll start for a change this side, Crowell Parish Council.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd do that for a change. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So, yeah, Ian Bowden, Kroll Parish Council. I want to kind of echo and agree with what Mr. McLeod said about the importance of maintaining strategic gaps and that being recognised to stop villages from joining towns and villages joining villages. And bizarrely, in the case of Kroll and Kroll Green, it's proposed that the strategic gap separating those is not included. And we wonder if that can be looked at. Kroll itself is both are independent medieval settlements, of which one is a conservation area. And it just seems really odd that the strategic gap, and contrary to what Mr. McLeod said, really odd and contrary to that strategic gap is not maintained. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McLeod, could you remind us of the reason why it's not carried forward into this plan?
So I believe in that case, the conservation area we felt provided, we didn't need that additional layer of protection for it because we felt the conservation area would provide that and sort of give enough protection. And we'd obviously assess that in terms of the impacts on the conservation area itself.
Thank you.
I just don't think that makes sense. I think, conservation areas and strategic gaps are two separate things. One may support the other, but I think it just doesn't make sense to remove a strategic gap that's already there and not recognise it. It won't prevent development, but it just creates an extra consideration, as was said previously. I see no point and no sense in not having it included.
Okay, we'll take your comments into account then when we're looking at the totality of this. There is a general tenet, certainly with greenbelt policy, that you wouldn't create new greenbelt on land that's already protected through other designations. So there is that general tenet in planning policy, but we'll bear that in mind. Thank you. Okay, moving on next.
Thank you, sir. Kempsey Parish Council. We voiced in our written submission some uncertainty about what the questions being posed in the issues that you circulated. I must admit, I'm still a little uncertain about whether your doubts or uncertainties are to the specific policy, i.e., is it a workable planning management tool, development managing tool, or should it be used in this circumstance in the South Worcestershire area, or whether it's the specific gaps that are under review. And I still must admit I have a little bit of uncertainty. I was trying to follow closely what you just put to Mr. McLeod, or to the three South Worcestershire districts. And it seems to me, if this is where I'm seeking some correction, please, it's the conflation of greenbelt policy and significant gap policy, which seems to be at the forefront. Could I ask, I know it's not usual to pose questions to you, but
no, that's fine.
Is that the heart of it?
That was the starting point, looking at the policy, because you had two very different things in the same sentence, okay? And then significant gaps don't appear again in the rest of the plan and the policy. So, Spectre's brain, start thinking about it. And what we have to do, we have to be satisfied that the significant gaps policy is, provision was justified. So there's this overall question as to whether, as a local designation, it's a justified thing to have in a plan. Is there the evidence produced by the councils to convince us that yes, you can do this? And if there is, it then follows in our minds that the designation of them, unless people try to convince us otherwise, the specific ones would be sound too. So there's a question about principle. We haven't delved in particularly into the detail, we'll let other people ask us about that. But given what the evidence, if we accept the council's evidence for the justification for them and the boundaries, we've accepted it, haven't we? If we don't, we don't. There's a two-stage, potentially a two-stage thing.
So it doesn't seem to be any question that specific gaps, or significant gaps rather, have a role to play. It's whether they're justified in this instance.
That's part of the package the councils have put forward. So they put forward a package of significant gaps. High-level question, is this the right thing to do in the plan? Is it justified? And if it is, and we accept their evidence, it should follow, unless we're convinced otherwise, that the gaps put forward in terms of what the council put in the policies map.
So if I proceed, I think, sir, on the basis that the coalescence of settlements is a proper consideration, then we go forward from that. And we know the green belts, in fact, seek to achieve amongst their 5 objectives that very thing. So in this instance, we're saying, is it justified to try to prevent the coalescence of the settlements being put forward in this plan?
Yep, that's a question we'll take away and consider the principle of it. Yeah.
And the concern that I've read from other representations is that in some way, significant gaps are a backdoor greenbelt. That seems to be the implication of them. I would draw distinctions, of course, between them. They share some characteristics. Openness is the most obvious one, and to maintain openness, and coalescence is the other. But in other ways, they differ. You've already pointed out that the very special circumstances test does not apply. And that's a very strong factor to differentiate between the two things. The second, of course, is permanence. Significant gaps do not have the same level of permanence as greenbelts. In this case, we know that they're subject to review. In fact, they have been reviewed as part of the South Worcestershire Development Plan review. And the authorities, having reviewed them, have come to certain conclusions about that. So it's clear that they can be changed through this sort of process. So they are distinct and separate. They fulfill quite some same things, but others are different. Protection of the countryside isn't a purpose of the significant gaps. Those are covered by other policies. We have that. And so there is inevitably some duplication between these things. But the main purpose is to safeguard the distinct integrity of settlements one from another. Kemsey has been mentioned several times. Kemsey's significant gap since the introduction of the South Worcestershire Development Plan, in fact, has been halved. Another illustration that, if necessary, significant gaps can be looked at again to see whether other material considerations overcome maintaining their full extent. So I draw a quite distinctive thing between the two, and I know others won't because they think it's going to be the same thing. 2-tier levels of protection are not unusual. Though I haven't said this in our submission, but my working life for the last 10, 15 years was in Wales. Wales, of course, does have 2 levels. It has green belts and it has green wedges. They do similar but different things. And I'm asking you to consider, in this case, these are different. I think your concern is that they have just been put together in with one policy statement, and they should be separated out. And I support that. I've only realised recently, on behalf of the Parish Council, that in fact a proposal has been put forward. I've read through it. It gives me some concern in terms of the wording and so on, but I can see what's trying to be achieved, and we would support that principle, if not that wording. I would like to hear what others have got to say and perhaps have a second chance of coming and responding to that, if I may.
Okay, we'll move on then. Given the time, if people do come back, it needs to be very brief, but we'll carry on around the table. I think we're probably getting somewhere with this now, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I'm a resident of Kemsey. I've been there for 70 odd years. 80 odd years. but the first few I obviously don't remember, but I did go to school in Kemsey. This significant gap policy and what have you started round about the year 2000, not exactly sure when, but it came forward and what have you as a way of trying to stop the merging of areas. And I was involved in that at the time. It then became a sort of an adopted policy in one of the original plans that we had, Malvern Hills plan, and it was under policy DS17, which I've sent to you, so I don't want to go back through that, and what have you, and obviously was there to sort of try and keep the various areas apart, such as Kempsey and Worcester. Now, Kemsey has been a sort of a dynamic village, because the developers that are all sat around the table have nearly all had a dabble within Kemsey. And we've had, even over the last sort of 6 years since the last policy was really implemented, we've had 550 houses built within Kemsey. We've also got a parish plan, and the parish plan is absolutely first class in this particular policy, because it comes down to whether the planning is likely to influence the sort of area between Kemsey and Worcester. And we have in 2 occasions that I know of, maybe more because I haven't been on the committees all that time, but we've had buildings that have been put up, industrial buildings that have been put up, and they were not affecting the sort of gap as such, because they were away from the sort of main road, and also adjacent to other industrial buildings and what have you, which was good. We've had alterations to houses, and that's all permitted and what have you, and it's all permitted within our parish plan within the village. I'm sure that you'll make the right decision. We've just, obviously, we've got 2,000 plus houses still to be built that were granted planning permission in 2006. 2016, and we haven't got a detailed planning application for those yet. So it's very difficult to sort of anticipate what even Kemsey is going to look like, or even Worcester is going to look like when they do build the urban extension. That's still got to come. We've got nothing yet, not a thing. So please, I'll leave it in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got 2 sort of points, or put forward into 2 categories really. One is to do with the notion of this significant gap in the first instance, but then there's a direct objection to the inclusion of one particular significant gap. I think first sort of point is a significant gap to not construct in sort of national policy. There's no policy basis at a national level. We'd question the need for them at all, really. I think we've gone into, in our hearing statements, we've explained in a bit more detail as to why, so I won't run through that in too much detail now. But there's a number of other policy functions or policies in the plan which will enable a development manager, case officer dealing with an application to assess the likely impacts on whether that be coalescence or the wider points which have now been brought in. And I think, so that was the point you made, and this policy has grown somewhat to incorporate all manner of other things now, which are landscape-based, in which we already have multiple other policies and other tools to which to assess the impact on landscape. I think you picked up on the point around the conflation with Greenbelt, but one thing that also struck me was that the additionality or additional points that have come in, the supporting text that in the local plan, or in the review plan, at 3.6 talks about these being important green spaces identified by local people. I mean, that to me is a local green space and has its own separate policy consideration and justification process, which the council haven't gone through. It's an entirely different process. And if they want to introduce local green spaces, then that should have been done in that way, not tagged on to an existing policy function, which is about gaps. It's about preventing coalescence. And that, you also talked about what a policy might look like, and notwithstanding sort of our concerns about whether they should be in the plan at all. If there is a policy, I do have some experience. I did have do a stint at Malvern Hills Council as a senior development management officer myself. I did actually give planning permission in a significant gap. And at the time, the consideration of that, there wasn't much guidance at the time, and we took my lead from appeal decisions that have occurred and other decisions made by the council. But it's very much about the nature of the coalescence. In that instance, was between Lysington and Malvern. And so it was an assessment about the impact of that development on the relationship between the two settlements. Ultimately, in that instance, it was decided it wouldn't undermine that gap. And so planning permission was granted. And so I think if there is a policy, I think having something which is far clearer about what would be allowed, and certainly nowhere near as restrictive as the supporting text here would suggest, which is very restrictive. It's no development unless your sort of agriculture and other things. You know, it's upping the ante somewhat on what the practical application of the policy has been in the adopted plan. And I think it should very much focus on this being about gaps between settlements. And if there is any value here, I can say as a planning consultant, if I'm sat there advising a client, I'm looking at it, I can say, there's a gap here which someone deems to be important. So that's something I need to, it's flagging an issue to me that I need to make sure we assess and look at properly as part of an assessment. It also would help, you know, my successors at the council to make that assessment. When it comes to the actual green gaps, or sorry, significant gaps themselves, then we've identified in our statement there is inconsistency in the assessment of those. Now they've set out criteria in the evidence paper on significant gaps, and within there, those criteria, so it talks about whether there's urban forms within those gaps, the relationship between settlements, and there's other bits as well. But in one instance, you may have a significant gap that's not been maintained because there's a trunk road running through. There are some examples. So, for example, sort of Beckford was removed because the A46 ran in the middle of the gap. In the case of the significant gap we're objecting to, which is the one on the northeastern side of Worcester, so it's between Worcester and Tiverton. You have, not only do you have the M5 running through that gap, you also have the junction, I think it's junction 6 by Worcester 6 Stadium, as it once was, and a whole range of natural landscape features, which are significant barriers to even the perception of the other settlement being there, let alone anyone actually successfully causing coalescence between the two settlements if they tried, which wouldn't be no one's objective, of course, but you know it wouldn't be possible given what's in the way. I think that inconsistency is an important point. I also think the nature of the assessment around that particular gap is important because that wasn't a strategic gap in the adopted plan. It was an area originally sort of to do with maintaining separation to the M5. But for all the reasons that may be included now, there are multiple other policies in the plan which would allow for that to be considered. It remains in the open countryside, so development as a starting point would be not acceptable in principle. There are landscape policies which would help maintain and protect the open, that would protect any special landscapes or any important features within that area. And so we simply don't think that is needed, even within a reduced sort of scope of being a significant gap.
Thank you. Shall we just carry on going around the table? You can come back with points after if you're happy just to deal with them in one. Okay, we move along then, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just wanted to echo comments made by Harrison there in terms of the justification for significant gaps in principle, and also the need for them given other policy restrictions, including the development boundaries, and indeed your concerns, sir, about the sort of proposed wording around the restricted nature of what's being intended there. And also just to draw your attention to a specific significant gap, which is at Lysington, which is a carried forward significant gap from the current SWDP. Its purported purpose in the assessment is effectively that it separates Lysington with Malvern, which is some 1.7 kilometres away, so a large gap as is identified in the appraisal itself. With the majority of land in between the settlements largely constrained in terms of development potential in any case. So the overall need, if you do find that the significant gaps can be retained, the overall need for the Lysington significant gap is questioned. It also includes land which has been built out recently on the edge of Lysington and land that's got planning permission more recently. So clearly the necessity of those areas within the significant gaps is obviously limited. So yeah, just to reiterate some of those points and question the justification and also raise those specific concerns in terms of Lysington. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, just quickly, if I can, I've been mulling this over. It's an attempt to be helpful, I think. That Part A of SWDPR 03, Roman numeral 1 and 2 are fairly, although not quite worded this way, they effectively say this is how much development that we're allocating. In other words, the housing requirement we're going to meet, to paraphrase. And number 2 then goes to provide a bit of a safety valve against that and talks about the windfall development within defined development boundaries. 3, 4, 5, 6, and I know I'm jumping across question 17 and 18 here, and I promise I'll do this quickly. Of course, the strapline for Part A is the spatial development strategy comprises the following principles. In other words, it feels like it's part of the reason justification. It's an explanation of some of the things that have been taken into account to arrive at the place that we've arrived at. Predominantly, they're covered under 3.1 to 3.10. If it's not, I know you've got specific comments, questions rather, about the wording around the openness to the greenbelt. We've just touched on that. The slight, it's slightly incongruous sort of fit, isn't it, under 5 and 6 with making effective use of land, being aware, it isn't aware, is it? It's recognising agricultural land, and then making effective use of land, full stop. It feels to me as though 3, 4, 5 and 6 need to come out, because I can't see how a decision taker would use those bullet points in trying to determine a planning application. And I can imagine, I can foresee a set of circumstances where we're talking either in a planning committee arena or at an appeal about what those things may mean for the determination of a planning application, particularly under the tilted balance. This would be the case when we're talking about basket of most important policies. And I think it'd be very difficult to arrive at a place where you would say how those things influence the outcome of that balanced judgment on an application. So just to summarise, and again, as I say, apologies for sort of jumping across 17 and 18, those two questions. But 3, 4, 5, 6 feel like reason justification, and they should come out. That's not to detract from any of the debate we've just had about the wording and how the wording might work and what it might mean under other policies, including the significant gap policy that's been put in front of you as a main modification. But with respect to SWDP R03, it would probably benefit from that change. And I say that, inspectors, full in the knowledge of the pragmatism you talked about this morning. In fact, we're not here to write the plan we want to write. I did say I'm hard about whether or not to say it, but I've said it now. So hopefully that was well received. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, because a number of those points are covered by the policies in the plan, aren't they? So maybe that's something that we could ask the council to consider. How much of this is actually duplicating other policies? But there is the element of setting the strategic policy. Because if it's part of the overall strategy, it needs to be set out in a strategic policy and not be in a non-strategic policy. But is it necessary to repeat? I mean, some plans are inevitably a combination of policies written by different people, some of which repeat parts of the NPPF, others which don't. Some repeat and policies elsewhere in the plan, and some don't. I think it's a fair point, and maybe that's a council to have a think about a main modification about that. Because points 1 and 2 are really the fundamental points in A, aren't they? Okay, moving on.
Afternoon, inspectors. Tom Harmsfield from Turley, representing Bellway. Been interested by all the discussion around significant gaps this afternoon, and we'll be interested to see the rewording of the policy. I won't comment around that any further. I think there's been a good level of discussion on how that should be perhaps worded and implemented. But my point is perhaps we're missing a fundamental point. Does the evidence actually justify using the designation in the first place? The former inspector from Kempsey made a very good point. It's not unusual to have designations such as this, and we see them elsewhere. And I think probably the most local example I'm aware of is green wedges in Leicestershire, which is still used to some degree. But when they review their green wedges, they do reports that are 70 pages long for each wedge. Here we have a report that looks at each wedge, and it's 2 pages per wedge. Sorry, I call it conflating there. We've got 2 pages per each significant gap, and then there's only half a page of analysis as to whether that area should retain a significant gap or not. If we're going to say this is a usable designation, as it's done elsewhere, understand that. But I think if we are going to use it, the evidence behind it actually needs to justify the use of it. And I think I'd point to the example of the Worcester West significant gap, which naturally is where my site sits within. I think the only thing I'd point on that is if you looked at that in more detail, the site to the south of us, which was in the gap, is now being built out for housing via appeal. Land to the north is proposed by the council for a Egyptian traveller site, which kind of maroons our site within the significant gap, and it sees the site remaining in it. Our submission, this is all in our submission, so I won't take you to it or anything, but the relevant part of the appraisal, the council's appraisal, is PDF page 42, and to see the analysis. I think perhaps we need to look a bit more at the evidence justifying it before we go too far down perfecting how it's actually implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, when we're looking at the justification for the policy, we have in mind paragraph 31 of the framework, which says that evidence or view of all policy should be underpinned by relevant and up-to-date evidence, which should be adequate and proportionate, focused tightly on supporting and justifying the policies concerned. So the example you gave of the very wordy, very detailed may have been adequate and proportionate in that case. We might find this is adequate in this case, but leave it to us. We'll think about that.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, I'm not saying 70 pages is necessary to appraise each of the significant gaps, but just sort of drawing examples of how this type of designation is looked at elsewhere. Thank you.
Yes, I wouldn't say it may not be necessary, but it may be in that case. But everyone remember, when you're preparing evidence, adequate and proportionate is what we like. Right, moving round to the corner.
Thank you, sir. Sian Griffiths, RCA Regeneration. Agree with what was just said there, actually, that more robust justification is required because significant gaps in this area are very politically popular, as you could probably imagine, and very politically driven, I'm afraid, particularly in those areas where they would love to have greenbelt and can't have greenbelt because the exceptional circumstances simply do not exist to justify them. I think that significant gap is very much a local tool, a smaller tool. It is not a strategic policy tool in that sense. And if there's no justification to prevent settlement coalescence through the addition of a greenbelt policy in that location, then I think you need to work quite hard to justify significant gap, therefore. That's not to say that there's absolutely no way there's any room for it, I don't suppose, but there do seem to be an awful lot of very large swathes of significant gap that have been proposed as allocation or designation in this plan. And I don't see it uniformly as being justified. I think it's a nice to have as opposed to a have to have in a lot of cases. I think we do need to get back to the idea that once this plan is out there, that the poor DM officers have got to then try and determine applications in light of these policies. And of course, this being the starting point. I, and I'm sure a number of colleagues, have successfully argued at appeal for development in significant gap when the tilted balance is engaged. So significant gap simply doesn't hold up, again, uniformly at appeal. And it then does make one question, well, is it really that robust? Why doesn't open countryside as a policy or function in the same way? Mr. McLeod picked up on a couple of points that I think are somewhat contradictory when in justifying some significant gap. I can't remember where in the plan area now, he mentioned that, oh, well, there's a conservation area and there are listed buildings, so the significant gap is an important part of that, protecting that. And then somebody else has raised quite rightly that conservation area and listed buildings are very well protected and have are protected for different reasons. It's about a spatial strategy, it's a spatial policy, but then are we also looking at the visual aspects like Greenbelt would have? You know, you've got the spatial and visual aspect to openness that almost does kind of, it can be used within one's assessment of preventing settlement coalescence. I've been at a number of grey belt appeals now since last December, and I know that word is not allowed to be used here today because the grey belt doesn't exist as far as this is concerned. But settlement coalescence has been brought up, and the visual aspect of that and the interaction between the visibility between two settlements and things like that. We are going to see lots and lots of appeals in significant gap that are going to be exploring these issues, and I don't think this policy is fit for purpose at the moment at all.
No, that's where we're trying to get to the point. We're asking about justification for it, but then if we consider it's justified, it's what it needs to say to be effective. It's not Greenbelt. It's not a local green space designation. It's not that high level of designation. It's a local designation, and there can be local designations if they're justified, but it has to be clear, because what we don't want is our colleagues haranguing us in sometime in the future going, hang on a minute, you found that sound, what did it mean? Oh, I don't know, you work it out. So we don't want to be in that position. I don't think anyone wants to be in that position. So we want policies to be effective, and we want it to be clear and easily understood by the users of them. So it's been a really useful discussion in that regard, actually, and just teasing some of this out. So do you have your board up?
Thank you, sir. Warndon Parish Council are one of those areas that they have the part of what's referred in the SWDP as the M5 corridor strategic gap running alongside Warndon villages. It was planned as part of the original layout. You might recall I said earlier that it's an urban extension that was extensively planned with landscaping and buffers and all the rest of it. So the part of what's now called the M5 corridor that runs up the side of Warndon villages and is now proposed to connect to other strategic significant gaps was always part of the original plan of Warndon. And when Warndon Villages, and when Warndon Villages was first built, there was the Warndon Plan, which set out the design principles and gave it some protection. When that fell away, it's only been through these significant gap type policies that it's continued to be protected. So from that point of view, Warndon Parish welcome this new proposed addition of a separate plan. However, in common with a lot of other people around the table, they would like it to be quite particular about what it's protecting, why it's protected, and what it's protected against. Because Warndon Parish has been bewildered many times over the years by being told that they have a strategic gap, but the council then allow planning applications in it that they don't want. And indeed, there's allocations being proposed. So on the one hand, the council are proposing a strategic gap again in this plan, but they're also proposing allocations in the strategic gap that the parish don't want. The parish would like to do a neighbourhood plan that protects as much of it as possible for all of the reasons that they're going to be able to lay out to back it up. But they have known at stages through this that they didn't want to end up being at odds with the SWDPR, because the first iteration, the council had apparently forgotten about this gap entirely. It was completely missed out. It's now been added back in. They're really concerned. They want it protecting because it was always designed as part of Warndon Villages. Whether you decide that this is how it's protected or another way, there are certainly areas of strategic gap or certain specific gaps that do warrant protection of some sort, even if it needs a different policy with a different name. But Warndon Parish in particular are, they are very concerned. They would like to protect it. They would like to know when it will be protected and when it won't be protected, so that they've got some reasonable expectation to share with their residents of what the council will and won't allow in this green buffer, and for them to then be able to go ahead with their own neighbourhood plan, knowing that they are in conformity. They would have appreciated being sort of consulted about it in a more upfront way, to not put these allocations in that they have objected to, that we'll come on to when we get to those in the later sessions. They are pleased that their gap has been put back on. It has, however, also been mapped incorrectly. It's completely off, for want of a better word. It's like it's over by a couple of metres, but instead of covering green space, it sort of meanders into the roads and misses some of the green space, which you have got down here as a separate point, but it is one of the ones that has been mismapped. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's some boards up on that side. If you're coming back comments, very brief, please, because we've all had to go and we need to move on. So we'll just start at the end, come up and come this way, and that'll be a lot for.
Thank you very much, sir. David, oh, sorry.
I just wanted to pick up on that last point about Warndon Parish Council. It strikes me, listening to what the bit are after, that's a local green space, it's not a significant gap. The gap is nothing about this stopping coalescence with somewhere else. It's about protecting particular green spaces around them, which they deem as a community to be important. And it's a very different policy construct which isn't being considered here and hasn't been proposed by the council and would be subject to completely separate assessment. And so I think we just need to be careful with that when we're looking at this, that this is about gaps and separation between places and where they have, if it's going to flow through, where are those areas that have that function primarily? There's other functions, so be it. But yeah, then that's where we should be focused on.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. 3 little tiny points. I believe that there's been a petition about trying to keep the significant gap within Kemsey. I didn't sign it, I haven't even seen it. But I believe it's had 600 residents. I believe it's been submitted to you, but I'm not certain. Kemsey used to be the largest village in Great Britain. Whether it still is, I don't know. But if Kemsey joins and the significant gap goes, we will be part of Worcester City. So we will no longer be a village.
Thank you.
Several points in response, so if I may, I'll keep them brief. Just as an aside, it was interesting to hear the Warndon villages being termed an extension area. I was responsible for planning Worcester at the time, and we were not reluctant in calling it an expansion area in those days. The points. You ask in question 17, is that justified and consistent with national policy? We pointed out in our submissions, Inspector Clues at the South Worcestershire Development Plan examination asked the very same question, and he came to the conclusion that it was. Now, obviously, you're entitled to come to whatever conclusion you may on the evidence that you've heard, but nevertheless, he heard that same point, and the NPPF at that stage, in my view, was not materially different. Secondly, there's been suggested that the policy is not fit for purpose because other applications have been allowed either by planning authorities or on appeal. To my mind, that just shows the significance of Section 38(6). If there are other material factors that weigh in favour of allowing it, then so be it. It's the proper process. Thirdly, there's a suggestion that the allowance for allowing the developments which might be allowed in the significant gaps are no more than in the countryside. Well, they have to be more than in the countryside, otherwise countryside policies alone will be sufficient. What we have here is an additional layer of consideration, and that is preventing coalescence. That's the strongest motivation for it. Countryside policies do not do that. It gives an additional consideration for the policy, for the decision makers.
Thank you. Right, Mr. McLeod.
I'll keep it brief, sir. So, I mean, it's important to emphasise these are not politically driven. They're obviously put forward, as just been noted in the last plan. They're evidenced and found to be sound through that process. And we've prepared a proportional update in terms of the evidence to take them forward in this plan. Coalescence is a perfectly reasonable planning consideration for us to be taken into account. There's been significant extensions to Worcester City, and keeping separation from Worcester City with some of those surrounding villages is a perfectly reasonable planning objective for us to be doing. And that's why we're continuing to propose them and keep them in the plan going forward. The DM-MAN process as well, just echo the points that have just been made. It's worked perfectly well since 2016. Has there been a moratorium or a complete stop on development? No, planning consents have been granted in significant gaps. So they've worked functionally since 2016 without a problem. But we understand your points around the detail of the policy that we've got drafted there, and we're more than happy to take that away and come up with some revised wording for you to consider, sir.
Thank you for that. What we will contemplate doing when we receive the revised wording from the councils is open to us to undertake an inspector-led consultation of just of the participants in this session on the revised wording, just to inform us of when we're writing our post-hearing letter. We'll see if it deviates greatly from the tone of a discussion we've had today. We might do that. It's an option for us. It just means it gives people a chance to make some brief written comments before we formulate our views and write to the council with our final views, before it then goes to the main modification stage, because it could help head off the need for another hearing session and further time in the process. So it's something we'll bear in mind that we could do, I've done before, if we deem it necessary. So I think we'll leave it at that point. Thank you very much for your contributions to this. We might do for the participants in this session, for very brief comments, just to really to see what, if people want to make any further comments to their submissions. It helps us to form our overall views for on what we do with it. It's just a way of just heading off, having to do that again at the main mod stage if we get to that point. But it would be something initiated by us, and just really to extend the discussion, extend the narrative, really. Okay, so again, thank you all for your contributions. It's been a very helpful session, actually. So we'll adjourn now. For those we're not going to see again, thanks for coming. I'm sure we'll probably see most of you again at some point in the next few weeks. And we'll take a break now until, what time do you want to start again? 3:35 when we come back to, or come to the green belt. How exciting.
Okay, welcome back everybody. It's 3:35, so if we can resume the sessions with matter 3, which is about the green belt. We've had a few changes of faces on the council side, so do you mind if we just do the introductions again? Thank you.
So to my right is Denise Duggan, a Principal Planning Officer, Duncan Rudge, who's the Head of Planning for Worcester City Council, and Hannah Millman, who's the Policy Team Leader for Worcester City Council.
Can we carry on so that everybody knows who everybody is?
Sam Silcox, Director at Harris Lamb Planning Consultancy.
Sian Griffiths, Director, RCA Regeneration.
Paul Hill, RPS, on behalf of Taylor Wimpey.
Sarah Butterfield from Pegasus Group on behalf of Catesby Estates.
Lawrence Holmes, Litchfield's Planning on behalf of West Mercia Police and Crime Commissioner, West Mercia Police and the Hereford and Worcester Fire and Rescue Service.
Okay, so question 21 says, do the proposed strategic policies establish the need for any changes to the Greenbelt boundaries? So the authorities have produced a Greenbelt study, a Greenbelt topic paper, and obviously we've had regard to the statement for this hearing session as well. So that statement refers to one site to be removed from the Greenbelt, that's Worcester Six Ways, and others to be inset from it. Just for my benefit, they're all just to be removed, are they? If we could just, yes, is that right?
Yes, that's the case. Yes, they're all to be removed. It's just different descriptions for the same thing. Yeah, thank you.
So from my perspective, I don't know if it would be helpful if we could just refer to them being removed, then all that nuances around insetting falls away. So there's MMs, which show those now to be taken out, and to clarify that the proposed employment allocations at Blackpool Road and Hartlebury Trading Estate should also be removed. And there's also a main modification relating to the Worsley House Mansions housing estate, which again, that refers to insetting, but that's a removal as well, I think.
Yes, that's the case, yes.
Okay, there's also some additional modifications proposed, which we've touched on earlier. Some of those I think are, in fact, main modifications. Anything that inserts new supporting text needs to be in a main modification. So we need to go across them both, but I think in practice they are all MMs in the event. So we'll discuss the detailed criteria in the policy later on under question 29. That's really all I've got on question 21, unless anybody else has got anything they wanted to raise particularly here. I'll take that as a no. So if we move to question 22, was the Greenbelt assessment undertaken on the basis of a clear methodology consistent with national planning policy for protecting greenbelts? Again, this is well covered in the Greenbelt study, the Greenbelt topic paper, and the Matter 3 hearing statement. I don't have any additional questions or need for clarification on that. Again, I'll open to the floor. Yes.
Thank you, Ma'am. Sorry, I realise you jumped to question 21. I just got a small point on question 21, if that's okay. And I won't need to elaborate, because I think the question is, do the strategic policies establish a need? I think if you've heard the evidence that I've given and others have about Droitwich should take more growth. If you're in agreement with that, then I'll put it to you, Mom, that there is a need based on the strategic policies for there to be a Greenbelt review in relation to Droitwich Town. We've also raised concerns about the deliverability of the two main allocations in Droitwich. That's the Union Street site, the PDL site, and the Hanbury Road site that jumps the motorway into open countryside. so those 2 points. And the third point kind of relates to infrastructure. I kind of invite you, Mom, to go and sit in a traffic jam, if that's appropriate. If you drive along the A38 towards the southern side of Droitwich, at peak times, you'll sit in a traffic jam. And that's as a result of about 1,500 units were consented and pretty well now or built out at Copcut and Yew Tree Hill. And the bulk of the Yew Tree Hill sites comes out at Pulley Lane. And there's very recently recently in the last year, traffic lights been put in there. There is no design solution to that, as far as I'm aware. But our site development can alleviate that problem. It can close Pulley Lane and put a new road to the south of our site onto the A38. So development can assist, and infrastructure can assist with those issues. And we're aware the Highway Authority are keen to talk to us about that issue. So that's, I suppose, the point of 21. In relation, if I can then briefly move on to the methodology issue, I think you said, sir, at the big. So, yes, sorry. That's okay. I think it's put at the beginning that the PPG. I think you said, sir, you're not utilising the current PPG, and I'm grateful for that. That decision at the beginning of the examination, because obviously we're aware the new Greenbelt PPG came into force on Thursday last week, and as far as I've seen, there's no transitional arrangements associated with it, unlike the MPPF, but I follow the logic. If you're following the MPPF, you should follow the PPG, and if that is the case, then the methodology for the Greenbelt review, would reflect previous advice on Greenbelt methodologies, and obviously the current PPG is wholly different. I heard you say you're potentially looking to future-proof the plan, unless I misheard that. So I'd have slight concerns about that if that were the case, and how that future-proofing might evolve. If that in some way involves additional housing, for example, then that would, to my mind, not be reflective of the transitional arrangements in the MPPF. That's in effect, this council has to be moving to a review of the plan straight away, because it's meeting less than 80% of the local housing need based on current standard method. So I just have some slight caution there. But on the basis that you're sticking with the current methodology, I do have concerns with the way the assessment's been undertaken, particularly onto those sites on the southern side of Droitwich. If you look at, I won't need to take you through it, but if you look at your leisure, the Greenbelt review, what it does, it carries out an assessment of those sites on the southern side of Droitwich, and the principal factor for saying those sites make a significant contribution is it talks about the closing of the gap between Droitwich and Worcester. So that is, if you look at every significant contribution aspect of those sites, it talks about closing the gap between Droitwich and Worcester. That's the reason it's saying for why those sites shouldn't come forward. We're promoting a site at Pulley Lane, Pulley Farm, that has a depth of about 350 metres to the edge of the potential new urban area. The gap between Worcester and Droitwich is about 3 to 3.5 miles if you go from the Copcut to Worcester Garden Centre. So I struggle to see, even based on the current methodology, how closing a gap that's 3 to 3.5 miles in length by about 350 metres would be significant. But that is the basis, really, for the Greenbelt review, indicating there is significant harm through the appraisal process. Thank you.
Okay, I think the future-proofing reference is one from earlier today that isn't necessarily relevant to this particular. I'm not sure what you were questioning there. Just a general concern about future-proofing Greenbelt or future-proofing the whole plan.
I was a little unsure myself on what was meant by future-proofing, but
It really was a question to the councils. There may be some minor changes to the plan that can be made so that it would be effective in terms of some of the changed policies. We're not saying, because it's not before us, to have a policy on grey belt. We're not saying that at all, for example. It's really the question to the councils, do they want to do that? We did that last time with the transitional arrangements following the changes to the original framework. But we need to be satisfied that any such changes would be sound, so therefore they would be for effectiveness. But there may be some things around BNG, because the things have changed, things are enforced now to reflect that accurately or whatever. Don't have to do that. But it might be sensible to do that to make an effective plan. We're not asking for it. We're suggesting to the council they might want to consider it. What we're not saying is, oh, this is, because the transitional arrangements exist very clearly for plans to continue to adoption, if possible, based upon the framework that's in place at the time of their preparation, their submission. If they wouldn't be up, the government would not have transitional arrangements if that wasn't the intent. But we're saying there are some things that they might want to, the councils might want to look at to make the plan effective going forward, where there have been some relatively minor changes. Other things we'll have to take on the chin. We're not going to be going, oh, I think you need to address the new housing requirement based upon revised LHN. Not doing that. Because government doesn't intend us to do that. Because if it did, it wouldn't have had transitional arrangements with it. We wouldn't be sitting here. So that was all that point was about. There might be some relatively minor things that could be done for effectiveness, but not anything radical, because that's not what the national policy says, and it's not what the government intends. It's certainly not what we intend. It's okay.
thank you, sir. Yeah, that's very helpful. I suppose what might be helpful then, if I may be so bold as to invite you in your report to make it clear in relation to the Greenbelt that you're not, very explicitly, that you haven't factored in the PPG as it exists today. So when that plan is being reviewed, it's quite clear it was based upon the existing guidance at the time, the NPPF.
That ought to be clear, but the revised PPG is largely concerned about grey belt. And grey belt isn't a concept in the version of the framework we're examining the plan against. There are at least one of those examples, the change to the PPG, that is clearly out of step with the framework we're using. So it's one of those that I think we would say set aside, it's not for us. There are implications of revised guidance and policy come later on. But it's not one that, because it's primarily about that, it's not one we would be looking for changes on.
I suppose other aspects of the PPG, it defines a strong contribution, for example. So I suppose if it's quite clear in your report, you haven't factored those definitions, and I think it'd be very helpful to all readers of the plan in the future. Thank you.
Okay, would the council like to respond on the points made there?
Probably more the specific points about the Greenbelt. We've obviously talked in the first matter about our approach towards the Greenbelt, and just re-emphasise the Greenbelt within our administrative area is fairly limited. So, if you look across the authorities as a whole, nearly 1,300 kilometres, of which 90 kilometres is Greenbelt. So it's relatively small parts of the districts which are covered by the Greenbelt designation. So where it exists, it plays obviously, as you'll be aware, a very important role. In the case of Droitwich, and the example which has been given here, obviously the Greenbelt separates Droitwich from Worcester, and the proposal which has been advanced here would obviously lead to the erosion of that and go beyond the defensible boundary, which we see as a pulley lane, into effectively open countryside. So We've talked about how our housing requirement can be met without reviewing the green belt, and we stand behind that point. So there's no justification here to be reviewing the green belt, and in particular, this proposal would have significant harms to the green belt and its function and purpose.
Thank you. Anybody else on question 22? So question 23, are exceptional circumstances fully evidenced and justified proposed alterations to the green belt boundary? Again, there's information before all of us from the authority's Matter 3 hearing statement and all the other documents. I don't have anything further on that I need to probe today. Does anybody else have anything on question 23? Nope. Question 24 then, are the proposed green belt boundaries clearly defined using physical features that are readily recognisable and likely to be permanent? There's an example given there of one of the allocations. We've touched on this already, but there's obviously the proposed main modifications to Part G of the policy. And then in terms of that site specific, there's another main modification dealing with that. There's also a topic paper on that particular site, which is the Blackpool Road site. That's attached to the Matter 3 statement at the end. Again, based on what's been put forward, I don't have any additional questions on 24, unless anybody else does.
Just going to, sort of press the wrong button then. Sian Griffiths, RCA. I don't know whether or not it was worth raising it now in terms of green belt boundary, or whether it was worth raising it in relation to Wesley Manor Village when that comes up, because you've specifically mentioned that one. Or should we have a chat about it now? It was just in relation to the point specifically about the green belt boundary and looking at the, I know we don't use the word inset map, but the way in which the development boundary has been drawn around the housing estate that is referred to as Wesley Manor Village does not utilise particularly permanent, robust and enduring features as its boundary, and appears to draw rather a strange, or results in a very thin, strange line of green belt separating Hartlebury and Wesley, which I'm not convinced has been justified particularly, given how strategic and how important green belt is on kind of a national level, really. I think this sort of tinkering around the edge to try and redefine a very small part of what I consider to be wider Hartlebury anyway, as something that does require further investigation. I mean, I'm more than happy to put forward what I consider to be a better boundary, but and obviously the estate itself does not contribute to the green belt. It doesn't contribute to openness. It doesn't contribute really to any of the purposes, because it's a housing estate, and it's a modern housing estate built around an old school which is listed. So yeah. Yes, so that's my point on the boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you. Can the council respond on that particular specific boundary?
Thank you. Yes, the boundary has been drawn to tightly around the housing estate at Wesley House Mansions, which is on the other side of the A449 to the main villages of Hartlebury and Wesley, which are adjacent to one another. And the boundaries used are the roads which surround that particular part of the estate, and also the rear curtilages of the properties that are within that area, and there's a listed building in the middle, which is Wesley House Mansion, and that is clear in the Greenbelt Review that should remain, not the listed building itself, but the parkland that's associated with it, that should remain out within the green belt and not be inset. So the councils have drawn the boundary around that, but to exclude the associated parkland area, so that the councils feel that those are defensible boundaries.
Just to add, if I may, looking at the Greenbelt assessment produced by Wood Consultants, that was an objective assessment, and that was a clear recommendation within the assessment. It would, I might suggest, be odd to carry forward into the plan all of the other recommendations, but not this particular one.
Okay, did you have anything else on that, or shall we move on?
I think the point is probably well worth being explored at the site visits, which I'm sure you will do, because once you see it on the ground and you can see where there are boundaries that are robust and enduring, I think you could probably draw your own conclusions as to why I've put forward this point. Thank you.
Yeah, as we explained earlier on site visit, the Greenbelt ones are some of the ones that will be likely to need to look at, so that's fine. So question 25 is really about some of the mapping issues around the employment sites at Blackpool Road and Hartleby Trading Estate. Rather than me having a go at that, could you just explain what was done and what's now been rectified?
Thank you. Yes. The modifications, or part of the modifications, were shown on the mapping, but they weren't actually reflected in the policy. So the policy we're suggesting modifications to the policy to reflect those changes so that it's clear to somebody reading the policy. Otherwise, they wouldn't be aware necessarily that those have come out of the green belt. And those sites are all sites that, other than the Wearsley House Mansion site, are all sites that are employment sites. And other than the site at Blackpool Road, Worcester, are all within the confines of the existing trading estates. They don't extend into the beyond that into the green belt, whereas that's not the case for the Blackpool Road, Worcester one. Do you want me to talk about that one? No, thank you. That one does go into Greenfield land adjacent to Worcester, but Worcester is obviously very restricted with regard to the amount of employment land that it can accommodate within its administrative boundary. And there's an large existing employment site there, and it was felt that it was exceptional circumstances to allow the expansion of the industrial estate into that part of the green belt, which is sort of severed partially by the dual carriageway, the A449 to the north. So although it is within the green belt, it's not perhaps serving the same purpose that a site, the other side of the A449 would be.
Just on that one, on the western side, there's quite a stepped boundary. It follows a few land boundaries, and there would be a area of greenbelt that extends back down to the road. Is that what's the justification for those boundaries?
Yeah, the boundary for the employment site has been chosen to make sure that with the flood zone 3 area is excluded from the employment allocation, and it accords with a ditch and some tree planting. So it's not a road, but there is physical features on the site.
Okay, so that's to the north.
Yes.
I think about the land to the west, where there's some existing buildings, I think a few dwellings, industrial buildings, which probably don't, or they may or may not, serve greenbelt purposes. So that's, you can see that, but it's that section down here. There's a sort of pointy section. It's that bit. And I've looked at it. We haven't been there yet, so I apologise for that. But it did strike me when I first looked at it. There seemed to be a bit of, not detached, but a bit of remnant greenbelt. But you might be able to explain why.
That's because the site that was suggested to us excluded that part of the area. Perhaps that's something we might need to consider.
Yes, because I think it's really the justification for the boundary that would remain, as per what it says in the framework, the permanence, etc. And whether that land actually serves greenbelt purposes in its current use. It might do. We've not been there, but we'll leave that to you to ponder. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to? Yeah.
Thank you. We are acting on behalf of the owners of Hartlebury Trading Estate. We just want to offer our support for the proposed main modifications to incorporate the 4 allocations into site boundary and remove them from the green belt. We do think that's needed for the allocations to be effective. It's slightly different to other locations, perhaps, where we talked about whether or not they need to be incorporated into settlement boundaries now. With greenbelt there, inevitably we'd have this sort of policy conflict if it remained in the greenbelt, because inevitably any employment development went onto that land would be inappropriate development. So we actively support the proposed mods. And I just wanted to reference a statement of common ground we put together with the council, which runs through what we've agreed with the council on those matters, and also to cover off exceptional circumstances, which is a question earlier, but I'll just draw your attention to paragraph 6.3 to 6.7, I believe, rather than run through them again now, but it sort of sets out sort of the reasons as to why we think that's needed in this instance and why that sort of meets that threshold.
Thank you. Do you have anything on that, or are you happy? So question 26 is about Worsley Manor Village. Apologies, I think I may have said that wrong earlier. From the Greenbelt. Is that necessary for soundness, and what are the exceptional circumstances for this? Again, the boundaries are in this question, but we've covered part of that with the question earlier. So if we can just revert to the first part of it, really, about what are the exceptional circumstances for it. Yeah, and probably can you mention the MMs as well? There are a couple of those on this one as well. Sorry, that's. You did cover some of this previously when we talked, so it's mainly that it's perhaps the same thing again.
Thank you. Yeah, the Worsley Manor Village, as it's called in the question, is an area of land that's sort of a fairly densely developed housing estate, and the Greenbelt Review considered that it had limited contribution to the Greenbelt itself, and they recommended that it be removed from the Greenbelt. which is what we've done, and we've explained that in the sorry, I can hear music. Sorry, in the topic paper on Greenbelt, we've explained that, sorry, what was the second part?
Circumstances, which is part of the question, it is set out in, as you say, the topic paper, but then particularly in your Matter 3 statement, you've gone into that as well. There's probably nothing else that you need to add. I think we've probably got that. Were your points covered off on 26, or would you like to? Sorry, I'm looking at RCA. Thank you. Anybody else on question 26? So question 27 is about the compensatory improvements required by the framework. And this again is covered in the authority's statement. I think with reference to most of them, well, all but one of the sites being previously developed land. Could you just talk us through the other one?
Thank you. Yes, the other one is the Blackpool Road, Worcester site, which is a greenfield site, which I referred to earlier. As we said, we've produced a topic paper, which is appended to the statement that we submitted. And the reasons for removing it, I've sort of covered it previously, the lack of employment allocations within Worcester, and the sustainable location of the allocation, and the potential limited to moderate harm to openness from the removal of the site from the Greenbelt. With regard, do I need to sufficient? Yeah, the mitigation. We're suggesting that the mitigation would be additional planting along the boundary of the site, and a proposed new footpath around the site adjacent to the Worcester Canal, and also to provide access to the footpath onto Blackpool Road, and that's explained in our statement with response to the matters, issues and questions. And we consider that these proposed improvements to the walking and cycling routes will provide the compensatory improvements to offset its release from the Greenbelt. It is only a relatively small site at 8 hectares, and as I explained previously, it's the southern side of the A449 as well. And most of the Greenbelt is the other side in that location. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's an I think, drafted as well, isn't there, site specific to that allocation, which picks up the points you've just...
There is, yes. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Oh, sorry.
Just to add, if I may, you may have picked up from Delta Planning's written statement on behalf of Maximus that at their paragraph 2.3, they're drawing your attention to the fact that they think 13 hectares of land should come forward rather than the allocation at 8 hectares. They're suggesting that 5 hectares of that could be used to provide flood mitigation, green infrastructure and landscaping. We just wanted to add that our position is that we think the smaller cut is justified. It follows clearly definable boundaries on the ground, and that it's quite conceivable that what they've referred to there as flood mitigation, green infrastructure and landscaping could come forward in accordance with NPPF paragraph 154H Roman numeral 2 as other development, including engineering operations in the case of flood mitigation. that wouldn't be out with policy on Greenbelt?
Okay, so question 28 is about Hindlip Park. Is the policy, criteria 4 of the policy, positively prepared in respect of this, and would it be effective? So I know Lichfield, you're here, you're here for this. So I think rather than me having a go at summarising things, you might as well, make your points now, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. I think I'd just like to start off by saying that obviously the policy is concerned with the core area of Hindlip Park. Just some very brief background to this. The core area is home to the joint headquarters of both the police and fire service. They collectively employ in the region of 1,500 personnel who are engaged in a range of operational, strategic, administrative, conference and training duties. Whilst they have been collectively headquartered at the site since 2018, that was with the Operations and Communications Centre opening. It has in fact been a much longer history for West Mercia Police, who have actually been headquartered there since 1967. I think in order to understand the importance of designating the core area as a regional emergency services and civil resilience site within the Greenbelt, it is important, in my view, to have a full awareness of the extent of the role and functions performed there, all of which are conducive to serving a common goal. That goal is paramount, and that is simply ensuring the safety and well-being of the British public. I'm not going to reiterate the various duties and functions of the site. That's in our matters statement, but I would ask that you look at those for some helpful context. One of the key issues for both the police and fire service is the need to ensure that they are able to evolve their facilities and services in meeting new and greater challenges. So very often these are dictated by changing government requirements imposed on them. This can often mean that facilities that may once have been adequate for meeting their intended purpose are no longer suitable. One such example at the moment is around firearms training and changes in College of Policing requirements, for example, which is effectively necessitating a redevelopment of the facilities there. So that just gives you a little bit of context. So what does it mean in planning terms? Well, they need a degree of certainty, which will be borne out in sound and effective planning policy, which clearly stipulates, firstly, the type of development that will be acceptable in principle within the core area of Hindlip Park. And I think, moreover, a policy whose wording is neither ambiguous nor has unintended consequences for the decision maker. So to really ensure this, it is imperative that the site is afforded a policy designation which, in our view, serves the same purpose as that which is set out in the form of policy SWDP 2E of the current SWDP. A policy, I think it's fair to say, has served its purpose very well, and indeed the need for which was recognised by Mr. Clues as the inspector of that plan. Now, just turning to Part F of policy SWDPR 04 as submitted to you in the Reg 19 plan, our view is that it's not sound for the purposes of paragraph 34 of the MPPF against which the plan is being considered. Whilst we go into some detail on that in the matters statement, I think it's worth just highlighting the two salient points really from that. Firstly, the policy wording would mean that it would be unclear as to whether it would be necessary to apply the very special circumstances test to any application coming before the council. I think the key distinction here really is that the test is a decision-making test. It's not a test for purposes of formulating planning policy, and I think that's very clear in paragraph 148 of the 2023 MPPF, and indeed Para 153 of the latest version. The second key issue is around Part 2 of the policy, which would effectively apply a form of sequential test when considering development proposals coming forward within the core area. This is simply not consistent with the MPPF when assessing impact on openness of the green belt. What it would effectively mean is that infill proposals would need to demonstrate why previously developed land within the core area could not be used first. And it would be unhelpful, I think, for both the applicant and decision maker, because paradoxically, the policy would support development for emergency services and civil resilience uses per se in the core area. It's probably worth saying we also have concerns with the supporting justification to the policy. I'm talking specifically in relation to parts A and C, and I'll come back to those in a moment. So clearly, therefore, policy SWDPR 04F as submitted raises significant concerns which would seriously undermine its purpose, which in practice would mean that there is uncertainty in the planning application process. There could be a greater risk of delay, for example, in the event of deferral or even refusal of an application, and increased cost to the public purse. But ultimately, there's a fundamental and overriding concern here, and I don't say this lightly, and that is that the effect of all of this could have grave consequences for the safety and well-being of the public. Frankly, if facilities become inadequate, and for example, the training of officers is impeded by undue delay and confusion in the planning process, there is ultimately a risk of somebody losing their life, which could be, for example, in a terrorist incident. That's how serious this is and why we need to get the policy right. Now, on a more positive note, I am pleased to say that after what has been a very extensive dialogue with the Council, aided by our representations to the Reg 18 and 19 stages, and indeed Council advice sought on both sides, we now have a position where policy 04F has been revised such that it would remove the ambiguity around whether the very special circumstances test would need to be applied to development. This is obviously set out in the Statement of Common Ground to you. Yeah. Indeed. Indeed. So I'll just come on to that, if I may, the mum. So parts 1 and 2 have been agreed of that policy. So I think where we differ with the Council is in the inclusion of the wording forming part 3 of the revised policy, that is to minimise and mitigate against any adverse impact on the openness of the green belt. The Council's position, as we understand it, is merely that part 3 reflects the wording of paragraph 149G of the 2023 MPPF, and that has been done because of where we are with the transitional arrangements set out in the latest MPPF. However, in my view, it's one of those instances where the latest MPPF is relevant and should be considered, and this, of course, is enabled by paragraph 34D of the 2023 MPPF. In this case, the latest MPPF, as we know, changes the position slightly with regard to how impact on openness of the green belt is to be assessed by the decision maker. So what I'm referring to specifically here is the wording now contained in paragraph 154G of the latest MPPF. In essence, this substitutes the words "not to cause substantial harm to" for "not to have a greater impact on." In my view, this creates something of a dichotomy between the development plan policy and the MPPF as a material consideration in the decision-making process. Again, if we were to, if it were to be adopted as proposed by the Council, it would create uncertainty, potentially in certain instances, as to how any perceived impact, conflict rather, would be addressed by the decision maker in the event that they deem there to be a less than substantial impact on openness. So again, raises the spectre of uncertainty and the risk of delay on important projects whose delivery is firmly in the public interest. For what it's worth, I think it would also have a perverse outcome, in fact, in terms of applicants of proposals on other greenbelt sites not actually being subject to that more stringent policy. It only applies in the policy wording to Hindlip Park. So paragraph 154G would effectively apply as a material consideration in any other, to all intents and purposes, to any other proposal on a different site. It will ultimately be down to, I think, as inspectors to come to a decision as to how that is dealt with, and I think that sort of reflects the discussions that we've had with the council. I think there's an easy fix here, and that is either to amend the policy wording as proposed by us, or indeed strike it out altogether, both of which could be dealt with as a main modification to the plan to make the policy effective. I'll just touch upon our other concern, which is around paragraph 4.5 of the reasoned justification. Obviously, you have the wording for parts A to C as set out by the council. I think, in essence, these are matters, in our view, that a decision maker could consider when determining whether there would be an impact on the openness of the greenbelt for a particular proposal. However, it's not necessarily the case in respect of every application. It's a fact-specific judgment, if you want to put it like that. Such considerations do not need to be used as a form of proxy policy criteria. But there are some other elements to this. Part C, for example, refers to considering development that would not lead to an unacceptable increase in the developed parts of the site. I would say, in terms of Hindlip Park, increasing the development area within the core area is not necessarily problematic in terms of the ability to infill sites. You know, that's allowed for by the MPPF. Another example I'll just briefly touch on is the need for a building with a large footprint, which of course could be considered to be disproportionate to the existing buildings around it, but nevertheless would not impact necessarily on the openness by virtue of what is around it. So those are sort of the key concerns. Hopefully that's given you sort of a helpful overview as to what our concerns are, where we've come from in terms of looking to resolve the policy. And I think I'd welcome the council's views on sort of the outstanding points of disagreement. Thank you.
Respond.
Yes, thank you. The council have considered again the position regarding the MPPF 2024, and in light of the changes with regard to the aspect about substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt, for the council considered that it would be perhaps put development or decision making in a difficult position if the policy was written in accordance with the previous MPPF, and feel that in this particular case it would perhaps be more appropriate if the policy referred to the wording in the latest MPPF. So in light of that, notwithstanding the proposed modifications that the council has suggested, on reflection, we're suggesting that Part F, Part 3 should be amended in accordance with the suggestion that Mr. Holmes has just made.
On what we're going to do with that here and now, but we've got plenty of information before us to make a decision.
Can I just add one point? Yes, it ties in with the discussion that you had a few moments ago in relation to the interrelationship between the 24 MPPF and the 23 MPPF. And whilst, of course, this plan has to be determined in accordance with the 23 MPPF for plan making, for plan making, once this plan is adopted in relation to inappropriate development or what is or isn't inappropriate development, that will be determined in accordance with the 2024 MPPF for development management purposes. And I think what we want to try and avoid is if an application comes in for DM purposes, that arguments don't then centre around whether or not the plan is out of date, because it's not consistent with the MPPF in terms of decision making. So I think this might be one of the exceptions where the Greenbelt policies do need to be brought into line with the MPPF 2024 for DM purposes. And I think in relation to the point that we've been discussing with Lichfields, that is a point that relates to paragraph F for Hindley Park. But I think it might also relate to policies C and D of suggested policy 04 at the moment, because that is now out of date in terms of dealing with what is and isn't inappropriate development. Because obviously we've got the grey belt, which has the dreaded grey belt, which has crept in. Yes. Yes. Fine. Yeah. So, okay, so then insofar as paragraph F is concerned, I think we would strongly suggest that in order to avoid the problem that somebody comes along and says, well, actually your plan is now out of date because policy F isn't consistent with the new MPPF, we should certainly agree the amendments that are now set out in a statement of common ground. But I think it does raise the wider point, which if you're happy to come on to, absolutely. I just thought I'd flag that up. Thank you.
Sorry, I am looking at you. You're...
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, it's just a very small point, and it was only because we moved on to Hindlip and I had a point to make under question 27. I'm really sorry. It was in relation to the compensatory improvement question that you mentioned, that it was not clear to me that there were any compensatory improvements in relation to Worsley Manor. Because what I wanted to make clear was that the land that appears as parkland to the south is in private ownership, is not public open space. I represent the landowner and we have made repeated submissions to this emerging plan. Thank you.
I apologise, we're backtracking, but can you take yourself back to compensatory improvements in regard to that particular Greenbelt change in that site?
Thank you. I think this is different because the site at Worsley Manor is already developed. It's not greenfield site, whereas the site that we were saying about compensatory what's the word? Measures. Yes, thank you. Compensatory measures applied to the greenfield site at Worcester. It's very different to the site at Worsley Manor because that's already developed, and we wouldn't be proposing compensatory measures there.
Okay, thank you. You got anything else on that, or no? Sorry, I can't see names or.
Great. To be fair, we probably will come back onto it in terms of question 29 because it was talking about this grey belt point. Yeah, no, so yeah.
So you're going to wait for 29? Okay, so question 29 then is about how best to work, well, the wording in policy 04, whether it's clear, justified and consistent with national policy, and whether the criteria as drafted would be effective. So we started with think possibly it might be better if, I know I stopped you then, but could you go back into explaining what you thought a possible solution in terms of the framework and any, yeah.
Yes, of course, Madam. I think we'd got to the stage where there was a concern that the policy as currently drafted would be regarded as inconsistent with the NPPF and therefore potentially render the plan out of date insofar as DM applications for Greenbelt are concerned. And we have reflected on this, and I think maybe the best way forward is to try and sidestep that issue by, if you just get the policy as amended out, Madam, where we essentially take out C and D, which is trying to identify what is and isn't inappropriate development, and simply have a paragraph which says something along the lines of what is and is not inappropriate development in the Green Belt will be determined in accordance with the applicable NPPF. Full stop. There we go. Great, thank you.
This is a more minor point, but on A, I think perhaps it needs to refer to the green belt as shown on the policies map, because that geographical interpretation is also missing from there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Criterion F we covered previously. So anybody else with question 29? Yes, sorry, I've already forgotten.
It's all right, don't worry. Sarah Butterfield of Pegasus Group. I've got a couple of points to make. One probably doesn't quite fit in any of the questions that you had, but is a point we've made in our matter statements. But if I start in relation to the question that you've just asked about the NPPF, it's probably a matter of clarity, really, in that if you're going to include reference to the latest NPPF, that should also include, obviously, grey belt in terms of appropriate or inappropriate development. And my second point really kind of relates back to the comments that we've made today about Category 1 settlements, the strategy that the Council are seeking to pursue, and the location of Category 1 settlements, and I'm talking about Hartlebury in particular, which are surrounded by Greenbelt, but which would sit, reasonably high up in the Council's strategy for development within Category 1 to 3 settlements. And we just feel that there is probably a case for exceptional circumstances to look at Greenbelt boundaries and identify land that could sit within that spatial strategy to really push it through effectively, and reviewing the Greenbelt boundaries to potentially identify additional allocations around those settlements.
The Council like to respond on that?
Yes, thank you. On the need to refer to Grey-Belt, we don't think that's necessary at all and not advisable. All we want the paragraph to do is just direct the DM officer to the relevant NPPF as it exists at the time. I don't know if anybody wants to make any other points about the exceptional circumstances.
No. RCA.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, I wanted to raise a sort of difficult paradox, which is ideal at this time of the day. It's making my brain hurt, but Para 143E of the NPPF 2023 does talk about being able to demonstrate that Greenbelt boundaries will not need to be altered at the end of the plan period. Well, I'm afraid I don't agree that this plan as drafted will allow that to be the case at the end of the plan period. And I think that is ironically as a result of the current prevailing NPPF that nobody wants to mention, the elephant in the room, and we can't obviously examine into that. But in light of the fact that there are going to be grey belt applications, if not currently, there will be, because I'm planning some, there will be a need to look again at greenbelt boundaries. There is also a consented scheme at Chateau Impney in Droitwich for, I think, around 200 dwellings. I'm looking at Duncan. He probably doesn't know how many there are, but Denise might know. And you know, that's going to be a scheme washed over by greenbelts, and one would be looking to surely take that out of greenbelt. I'm not representing those people, but we are in a situation, unfortunately, that runs parallel with this examination, where greenbelt is something that the government has said can be can result in development coming forward in light of there being need tilted balance, the grey belt, the golden rules. So I think that we're in a situation where we cannot categorically say that Para 143E or that this plan is being prepared in line with Para 143E. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to respond on that point?
With regard to that, as we said at the beginning of the discussion, the Greenbelt is a relatively small area of South Worcestershire, and we feel that the Greenbelt boundaries that are defined in the current plan are defensible, and we feel that that they may not need to be altered in a future plan. There's nothing to show at this stage that they would need to be altered. And with regard to the reference to the Chateau Impney, I'd just say that as far as I'm aware, that hasn't been officially granted planning permission yet. I think they're still signing the Section 106 agreement, and that was a different case. That was a hotel that was a Grade 2 star listed building, and there was special circumstances for allowing that, or exceptional circumstances for allowing that development in the Greenbelt.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think that's everything. I haven't got anything else on question 29, and that's the final question. So that's the end of day one. We'll resume tomorrow at 9:30 for those of you who are going to be attending for matter 4, which is the provision of housing. So thanks everyone for their contributions and hard work today.